All right, hello and welcome. This is lesson 8 of Last Epoch University. It is the second part of the defenses section. So we've already covered HP, war, sustain, and resistances in lesson 7. If you've missed that, please go back and check it out. That's kind of like the foundation for defenses. So it's a pretty important topic. But now we're going to get into everything else, which is quite a few things. We've got armor, we've got dodge, we've got endurance, block, critical strike defenses, glancing blow, stun avoidance, damage reduction provided from classes, and debuffs. So let's go ahead and get into it. Let's start with armor. Armor is a staple defense in Last Epoch. Every build ends up using it. I can't think of a single build that would have any even way to get rid of it or would want to. It is a damage reduction for hits. So it doesn't apply damage reduction to dots. It is also more effective for physical damage, meaning it's less effective for non-phys. So if you take physical damage, it will reduce the damage you take further than it will for, say, fire damage or necrotic damage, etc. The formula for how much damage it will reduce is partially determined by area level, as well as, of course, the armor value that you have. So let's start by looking at it in game. So armor is shown here, and we see this character has 1492 armor, and that equals 41% damage reduction for physical. However, if you hover over it, it says armor is only 70% effective against non-physical damage. Mitigates 29%. So if I were to take void damage, it would be 29% mitigated versus the 41% for armor. As that number goes up, the amount that it mitigates increases. Bear in mind, this is also affected by area level. So this is area level 47 right here. If I were to go to, let's just somewhat quickly try to go to the end of time, which should come into our character's area level, we will see that the amount of armor we actually have decreases as far as mitigation. The number will stay the same, the numerical 1400 or whatever we had. But we'll actually drop to 32% in this case and 22% for non-physical. So this is an area level 91. So at area level 100, it would be even lower. So generally, when we gear for armor, we are thinking about what it does at area level 100, since that's where everyone is intending to get to. I know where I'm going for sure. All right. So if you want to know how much armor that you're gonna have as far as mitigation based upon, or how much percent mitigation based upon how much armor you have, Tonk Lab, which is a website that is really, really good for a lot of just tools and resources, has this cool little slider planer thing where you can pump in area level, which again, usually people use at 100, and then how much armor you have. You can increase it, decrease it, and you can look at the slider and see, let's see if I have 10,000 armor, I have 77% physical and 54% non-physical, whereas if I had 5,000 armor, it'd be 63 and 44. So a nice little handy tool. We'll be going back to Tonk Lab here in a minute. Great way to get an idea of how much armor you're actually gonna have as far as mitigation based upon how much you can scale on your character. Sources of this come from gear, blessings, skills, passives, all the areas you'd expect it to come from. The most support for armor, it comes from Sentinel. Sentinel has a lot of armor support, but there's some support in every class. So any class will scale this, and just how much is determined by a number of factors. A lot of it having to do with your build and what your build's capable of. Okay, let's talk about dodge next. Dodge is very different from armor. Instead of having a percent mitigation on a hit, this has a chance to completely avoid the hit. So if you have 40% chance to dodge, then 40% of the attacks that are used against you will be completely avoided. They won't hit you at all. This means they also won't apply any sort of debuffs to you, no ailments. So even though you can't dodge a dot, say there's a dot pool on the ground, let's say there's a bleed pool on the ground. If you walk over that, it can't be dodged. However, a hit that would apply an ailment like bleed would be dodged. So it just wouldn't apply the ailment. So then you wouldn't take the damage from it. Dodge caps at 85%. I should also point out that so does armor. Armor caps at 85%. You'll never reach it. It's also true of dodge. You'll never reach either of these caps because of the way that it scales. And if we look at Tunk Lab again, you can see even as we scale up to insane numbers, it never quite reaches 85, and it never will. It'll get very, very, very close, infinitesimally close, but it will never quite reach it. There we go. Okay. So it caps 85%. However, there is one exception, which is Silver Shroud, which is a buff that you can get for Rogue, which gives you a guaranteed dodge. One guaranteed dodge. Very powerful when used situationally. As far as I know, that is the only exception to dodge right now. All right, we already showed Tunk Lab and how the formula is determined. It is also partially by area level, just like armor. Sources for this are the same as for dodge. Rogue has the most dodge support. Primalist also supports it, and then there are some random pieces of support in other classes, but those are the two that typically support it the most. All right, endurance is a mechanic that's pretty unique, I'd say, to Last Epoch. I haven't seen anything quite like this in any other game, so it can be a little complicated at first, but once you get the basics down, it's pretty easy. There's two parts to endurance. So first off, what endurance is it says, okay, if you go below this amount of health, you will be provided with damage reduction. So let's say 500 health is your threshold. If you go below 500 health, then endurance kicks in and gives you damage reduction up to 60%. And that damage reduction is not damage type specific. It's not hit or dot specific, so it will reduce any incoming damage once you go below that threshold. And of course, it's like I said, it caps at 60, and you have a baseline of 20%. That is the actual damage reduction portion of it. The threshold is determined by a number of other factors. So you have a baseline 20% of your HP. So you have a baseline of 20% damage reduction at 20% of your HP. So if you have 1,000 HP, 200% baseline, or 200 HP baseline is covered by endurance on every character. And if you go below 200 HP, you will have 20% damage reduction. Now you can increase the base threshold by a couple of ways. There's a percent threshold thing that you can add on certain classes, where it says, okay, instead of 20%, you have 35% of your total HP. And then there's also just base thresholds. It says 50 endurance threshold. So if you had 200, now you have 250 endurance threshold. These are stats that you can get in the game to increase the total amount of threshold to get it closer to the total amount of HP you have. Something to note about endurance also is that in some games, when you have this kind of like a threshold thing where it's like, okay, if you drop below this amount of HP, you have damage reduction, it doesn't apply until after you've gone below it. So if a hit takes you below the threshold, that doesn't count. Only the subsequent attacks after you've gone below it do. That is not the case for endurance. Endurance will apply partially. So if you have, let's take that scenario where you have endurance threshold that starts at 200 and you have 1,000 health. And you take a hit for 900 damage, so it drops you down to 100 health. 100 HP will be covered by endurance because that brought you 100 HP below your endurance threshold. So out of that 900 damage, 100 has the additional damage reduction from endurance. You'll take a little bit less. Sources for this are gear, blessings, and primalist passives, with primalist having the main support for this. So typically people like to cap their endurance at 60%, depending on the build, but generally if you're a health build, they like to do this. This is a pretty good way of mitigating one-shots a little bit, and also mitigating taking too much dot damage and dying from that. So it's a pretty powerful option for at least some of your defensive support and preventing yourself from getting just absolutely smashed. Not always effective enough to do that. If you take a really, really massive hit, it's not going to matter. But it's a nice additional layer of defense. Next up, we've got block. Block is something that probably most people are familiar with, but it's done in different ways in different games. Here's how it's done in Last Epoch. You have a chance to block, and then should you block, you will reduce a portion of the hit damage that you take. And that will be based upon block effectiveness, which we'll talk about in a second. You cannot block dots, and you cannot prevent dots from being applied to you, like ailments from being applied to you, because you blocked an attack. All that a block does is reduce the amount of hit damage you take from a hit. So we talked about there's two parts: block chance, which in some cases can get to 100%. It is possible in some builds and certain circumstances. And then block effectiveness, which improves your damage reduction from blocking. So the higher damage block effectiveness you have, the more damage reduction you get when you are blocking an attack. And this also follows a similar formula to what armor and dodge did. And once again, Tunk Lab has this covered. We can see it here. And this one, I believe, also caps at 85. Yes, it also caps at 85%. So that's as high as you could possibly get, and you'll never reach it because of the way the formula is calculated. But you can get quite a bit of block mitigation if you have high enough block effectiveness. There we go. There's also one other affix that can further increase the damage reduction you have from block. It's a separate damage reduction called less damage taken for block. There's a suffix you can put on a shield. So you can even get more out of the damage reduction for block than block effectiveness offers you, which is nice. You don't need to wear a shield to block, but it's far less effective to not have one because shields provide so much block chance and block effectiveness. But it is possible. You will find that you can pick up block chance, block effectiveness in other ways, and they still work. Like you can find 5% chance to block and 200 block effectiveness in a node. I don't know if there's actually quite those numbers, but there are things like that. You can pick it up and you will get some damage reduction from it. It just won't be very much. Block stats are found on gear, especially shields, blessings, skills, passives. And most of the support for this is on Sentinel, with some support on Mage, and there's technically some things for Rogue as well. Okay, critical strike defense. So critical strikes are really bad to have happen to you. They are double the amount of damage taken from enemies. So you don't want that because that's a pretty good chance it's going to kill you if it's a big hit. There are two ways to mitigate critical strikes. The first is critical strike avoidance, which is a chance to prevent a critical strike completely. So if you have critical strike avoidance and it works, it counts. Let's say you have 50% critical strike avoidance, you get a crit, and it actually it rolls and the critical strike avoidance is applied, then you won't take any additional damage from that hit. It caps 100%, which makes you unable to be crit. This is something that builds tend to strive for, that go the critical strike avoidance route. You want to get capped so that you don't have to worry about the big damage spikes. Sources for this are gear, blessings, some class passes, Primus Idols. The Reign of Dragons blessing is currently by far the best place to get it because it's 75%. 70 or 75. It's somewhere around there. I think it's 70%. So 70% of your critical strike avoidance can come just from that. And then one suffix, usually 1 tier 5 suffix, can handle the rest. And so you can handle those two ways. So this is where most people get theirs to cap it. But there are some other ways to do it. Primalist has some pretty sneaky ways to do it as well. The next stat is reduced bonus damage taken from critical strikes. So this works differently from critical strike avoidance in that it doesn't prevent a critical strike ever. It will not stop a critical strike, but it will reduce the amount of damage you take when you get a critical strike. This can also cap at 100%, at which point you will take no additional damage ever. So the effect is the same from both. If you cap either one of them, you'll take no additional damage from critical strikes. One will just prevent you from taking a critical strike altogether, and the other will prevent it from doing any additional damage. It won't drop you below the baseline damage, so it's not like if you have 100%, you're going to take no damage. You just won't take any additional damage from a critical strike. The double thing, it just does not apply. The nice thing about bonus damage from critical strikes is, unlike critical strike avoidance, even if you haven't capped it, you still always benefit from it. So critical strike avoidance isn't capped. You're still going to get some crits in there, so you're going to get those big damage spikes. Reduced bonus damage from critical strike will consistently lower the amount of damage you take from your crits, and so it reduces those spikes, and you don't really need to get capped quite as badly because of that. Like if you get 95% reduced bonus damage taken, you're only taking 5% more damage from a crit. That's not a big deal. All right, Glancing Blow is a rogue exclusive damage reduction layer that reduces hit damage by 35%. It works kind of similarly to, well, doesn't really fully work similarly to really anything, because it's just a straight 35% that can also cap at 100%. So every hit you just have 35% less damage taken. It has no effect on dots, so that's similar to armor. And it is mostly acquired from rogue passives, but also from Dusk Shroud, which is a buff that rogues can get when they perform certain actions. Okay, stun avoidance. So stun is a thing in this game that can be frustrating. Not having access to your character to be able to move for a second or so can be the thing that kills you, and the way that, at least currently, pre 1.0, it is formulated can cause pretty small hits to just randomly stun you, so it's not great. Generally, players want to try to get to a point where they get stunned less often. One option might be stun avoidance, which specifically reduces the likelihood of a stun from a hit, and is found on gear, skills, and passives. This basically works like extra HP on top of your character in the formula for stuns, because the formula for stuns is based upon the portion of health that you lose on a hit. So the more portion of health you lose on a hit, the more likely you are to be stunned. So this just acts like you have more. So if you have 3,000 health and you have 1,000 stun avoidance, the calculation looks as if you have 4,000 health when you get hit. Because it works based on health and the total amount that you take in proportion to how much you have, stuns can also be reduced by reducing damage taken or increasing HP or your ward pool. The smaller the hits compared to your health pool, the less likely you are to be stunned. So typically, at least before 1.0, and I assume probably going into 1.0, people don't build for stun avoidance because it takes away from their ability to be tankier, and they just build for getting tankier to try to get stunned less often. Okay, let's talk about damage reduction from classes. So these are things that specific classes get access to, and it's exclusive to them. So there are things that Primalist gets that no other class can get. There are multiple ways to do this: passive tree and through skills. There are so many of these that I'm not going to cover all of them. We're only going to talk about passives today. We're not going to talk about skills. Like Flame Lord has a bunch of damage reduction you can get for mage. There's a number of these skills. There's a lot of ways you can get them in skills. And this also won't be exhaustive for passives, but it'll give you a good overview of how they work. And this is probably most of the passives that you can get. So we'll start with Acolyte. Acolyte has Elixir of Death, which is physical and necrotic damage reduction potion use for a period of time. I think it's 4 seconds. It's a pretty powerful node, but only if you're using your potions consistently. So it does have some pretty active gameplay usage. Mage has Arcane Shielding, which gives you damage reduction per stack of Arcane Shielding you have. You build it up through hits, if I remember correctly, and then you gain DR for a period of time. Primalist has more than Mage and Acolyte. It's got Berserker, which is damage reduction while at low health. This is a very powerful node right now for people that want to go low life. I think it's like 25%, so it's quite a lot. Ursine Strength, damage reduction from nearby enemies, which is built into the Beastmaster tree, which is pretty melee heavy, so that's really good if you're going to be... It's good for whether you're melee or not, because even if you're ranged, melee enemies are going to come up to you, but very good for melee especially. Then Aspect of the Boar is a very powerful option that gives you a lot of damage reduction when the buff happens, which can happen either when you get hit or when you hit. So there's a couple of ways you can handle it in the passive tree. Rogue has Evasion, which is damage reduction while moving. This is also very powerful because Rogue tends to want to move a lot and not be staying in one place. Death's Door, another damage reduction while at low health, so great for low life builds. I think it's 24% damage reduction. And Prolonged Demise is damage over time damage reduction. Damage over time is the hardest thing to find mitigation for, as you probably noticed in their initial offerings there. Dodge, armor, block, glancing blow. These don't affect damage over time. Endurance does, but it's one of the only options, which makes damage over time particularly threatening. So when you can find sources of damage over time, damage reduction, it's really good. Sentinel has Armorclad, damage reduction from nearby enemies, similar to the Primalist node. Void Aegis, which is a chance for damage reduction when you get hit. Osprey's Bane lets less fire damage taken when you block. Specific to fire damage, not any other type of damage. And Hammer and Anvil is a very interesting node, where if you are not using a throwing attack, it gives you 25% damage reduction if you take all 5 nodes, or 5 points in it, but also reduces the damage you do by 25%. And there's Liquid Iron, which is another damage over time damage reduction. Okay, so that covers a good portion of what you can kind of expect to find as far as options for damage reduction. Again, we didn't cover skills, so there's quite a lot more out there, but that should give you a good feel for the kind of things you can find in this game. How does it work, though, when you have multiple damage reduction sources? So let's take, for example, you're a rogue, and you happen to be a rogue that blocks, which is a thing, and you have 50% damage reduction from block, So you actually do block, and you have 35% damage from glancing blow, and you also have 25% damage reduction while moving. So you happen to be moving, you take a hit. That hit also is a glancing blow and is blocked. It's 50, 35, 25, which is more than 100%. Does this mean you mitigate all the damage? No, it does not, because damage reduction is multiplicative, not additive. So let's take an example here. You take a hit in this scenario where you have your block, your glancing blow, and your damage reduction while moving all active. You take a 100 damage attack. So you block it. That's 50% right there. So you've already halved the damage you're taking. So you're now down from a 100 damage attack to a 50 damage attack. And now you've also got a glancing blow. So that's only 65% of the damage that you would take. We're already at 50. So now 50 times 0.65 is 32.5 damage. And then we also calculate the after damage reduction while moving. So that's 0.75%, 75% of the damage you take. So 32.5 times 0.75, it's 24.375 damage you'll take. So we went from 100 to 24.375, which is just a bit more than 75% damage reduction. It is important also to note that order of does not matter. So we could do this calculation in any order. Order of operations says multiplicative stuff doesn't matter. So if we did GB first and then block last, it would still be the same. Okay, let's also talk about debuffs. This will be the last thing that we have to talk about in this lesson. There are ways to reduce the enemy's damage, which thereby reduces the damage you take. It's not, direct damage reduction the way we traditionally think about it, but it's just as effective. For example, you can debuff the enemy with frailty, the frailty element, which reduces damage dealt by 6% and stacks up to 3 times. It should be noted that frailty and chill are multiplicative stacks, which means this isn't 18%. It's more like 15 or 16% damage reduction, but still it's good, right? 15+% damage reduction is always going to be welcome. And it's found mainly on gear, skills, and blessings, and usually 1 tier 5 somewhere. Chance to apply frailty on hit is enough to get you consistently capped on it. So definitely worth it. Chill reduces attack, cast, and move speed by 12% and also stacks up to 3 times. Again, remember this is multiplicative, so it's not 36%. It's closer to like 32 or something like that. Still really good. Also found in gear, skills, passives, and blessings. Generally, 1 source of it is enough to take care of it. Blind halves crit chance and affects range enemies' ability to aim. This seems really good on the face of it, but do be warned that it becomes harder to actively avoid ranged attacks when you don't know where they're going to aim. So typically players do avoid this, but the having other crit chance is really nice. So it might be something to consider. Okay, the last thing on debuffs is there's a few that don't actually provide direct DR, like they don't reduce the damage the enemy does or the attack speed, but they can prevent the enemy from attacking at all, thereby lowering DPS. Like if an enemy is frozen, feared, or slowed, especially frozen and feared, well, their DPS is 0 because they can't do anything. And then in the case where they're slowed, they can't reach you, and if they can't reach you and they're a melee enemy, then they also can't do anything and they don't do any damage. So these are very powerful. Stun is also one that I could put on here. Stun is if your enemy is stunned, they can't do anything to you, they can't perform any actions, therefore they can't deal damage. Okay, if you want any more info on defenses in general, I have a very large article on Maxroll that covers defenses pretty exhaustively, so please feel free to check that out. And also, of course, you can ask me any questions, especially in my Discord or while I'm streaming. Those are the best places to reach me. I'm streaming a lot, especially at and beyond 1.0. I'll be on all of the time, and my Discord is a great place to join and ask me or the rest of the community questions. All right, thank you so much for watching this. The offense will be next. We'll have that out real soon. Enjoy your time in Last Epoch, and see you real soon.